back to the Tech First Talks podcast.
Lovely to see you again, Charles. How are you?
I'm doing very well. It's been an exciting year since we last spoke. A few things have happened. A bit more chaos in the geopolitical spectrum, which is obviously very good for you. I mean, it was just, about 14, 15 months ago, you left the Economist and started GeoPol Asia. And just in time for Trump, tariffs, and the complete chaotic world that we're living in today. So how's everything been for you since we last spoke?
I think when we did last speak, you congratulated me on the timing. I think I should have started 6 months earlier, at least, to give me a bit of a lead time into all of this. But it's been a very busy year. I mean, everybody knows it's just nonstop, right? One thing after the other. So trying to keep on top of that, work with clients who are struggling. I think many firms are struggling to deal with this in the first place, and the whole sort of the deer in the headlights type of syndrome. What do we do? How do we react to all of this? Is this for real? Do we just sort of wait and see? And how all of those sort of calculations changed over the years has been very, very interesting to observe.
Well, it has been a bit of a wild run, let's just put it that way, to put it mildly. So I can understand why clients are concerned because, and we thought the pandemic was bad. That was more predictable than what's going on today.
Yeah.
It is just a bizarre world.
Yeah.
I want to come back to something you said in our podcast last time, which is probably the best answer of the year I got. And I liked asking people, if the world goes to shit, where do you go? And your answer was, well, we go to the pub because why not? We might as well. So my question to start off today is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how close are we to getting to the pub? And let's say that 10 is you're in the pub, you put the card behind the bar because I'm going to be here a while.
Yeah. I think I've definitely put my coat on and I've walked towards the pub. And I'm hoping it's open.
Yeah. Well, I think there's going to be a lot of people queuing up there pretty soon. So I'm starting to think the same way you are. So let's also go back to the key themes you had from last year. So you talked about Trump, tariffs, and tech were your predictions for the year. Pretty much nailed that one spot on. But how do you look at that now when you go back? Do you think, wow, I got lucky, or holy shit, it went better than I actually thought?
I think it was a little bit easy to see this coming up over the horizon. We already had a Trump presidency and it was well telegraphed what was going to happen when he comes back in, right? That they were going to be absolutely ready for day one. They've got their agenda set and so on. That was an easy one. And the tech side of things, I think, this growing, good friend Alex Capri, who talks a lot about techno-nationalism, this has been growing for years. We've seen the sort of the tensions and the focus on semiconductors, the technology around all of that. That, of course, was going to get amplified. And the tariffs, I think that was, yes, you could expect some more trade friction. The extent of the tariffs and the disruption was something I wasn't prepared for. And I don't think many others were. And of course, that continues. We had the whole Liberation Day and all the so-called negotiations throughout the summer and these so-called deals, which, again, good friend here, Debbie Elms, calls napkin deals because they're literally written on a napkin. And of course, all of these might be ruled illegal by the Supreme Court at any moment. So, that sort of continues. But there are some other sides to that as well. In Asia, the big question was the relative tariff rate. When you're thinking about supply chains and do I start moving my supply chain? That's a big cost. These things, you don't just pick them up and move them around. It takes years and you've got the whole ecosystem around it and so on. So you really need to see, what's the difference between, say, Malaysia and Vietnam or Taiwan and Indonesia. And actually the difference is they haven't changed that much. So I think one of the surprises is that supply chains, yes, of course, there's a big focus on their security and resilience and all the rest of it, but there hasn't been that wholesale rejigging of supply chains that I was expecting. I think many were looking at as well. That's not to say it's not happening and that there aren't sort of pressures to really closely look at your supply chain and particularly when it comes to those parts of the supply chain that are in China and you've got this whole added layer of transshipment, local content, and all the rest of it. So there are those issues there. But I think the shifts that supply chains that I and others were thinking of hasn't really taken place.
I think there's another year to start planning on that because who knows what kind of tariffs are going to come around this time. But you had your 3 predictions from last year. Are you going with those same ones again, or do you have any new predictions for the upcoming year?
What has come to the agenda a little bit more, if last year was the year of trade turmoil, let's say, I think we're going to see, or we have already seen, at the beginning of the year, hard power We talk about the soft power of states. We talk about the hard power of states. We talk about the influence and all these type of things. But we've seen demonstrations from the US of the use of hard power. Economic security equals national security, increasing defense budgets. I mean, the defense sector is going gangbusters, right? And the application of hard power, that's the harder edge that we'll see throughout 2020.
Yeah, I can't wait to see how they're going to be able to meet a lot of these defense spending targets across Europe, because it's going to be a challenge. But this is a good segue now, because we can talk about Davos, because this is the week of the World Economic Forum. And yesterday was Trump's speech, which we won't cover it in too much detail, but it was so much fun. We have to talk about it a bit. So to start off with, I just loved the fact that he started calling Greenland Iceland in the middle of it.
Yep.
And a lot of the press has been having fun with that. I just saw that the U.S. press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, I think her name is, has come out and said to a reporter, that's a lie. He never said that, which of course, maybe half the world just saw him saying that. So that's, I find, kind of entertaining. He insulted pretty much every leader he could in the room as quickly as he could. He said he wants ownership of Greenland. But then a few hours later, he suddenly backed down from everything. He gave a really strong speech saying that we want right title and ownership of Greenland. And then a couple hours later, okay, we're not going to do that, and we're not going to put those tariffs in place.
Let's take a step back, and we've sort of seen this movie before. The big bow wave that comes out of the demands, the outrageous demands, and the maximalist demands, and so on. You know, it's 100%, it's my way or the highway. Something happens, generally in financial markets, and there's a rolling back of those demands. And suddenly, I had a great conversation with Mark Rutte. Suddenly, Denmark, they understand my thinking. Okay, military is off the table. Well, you know, great, because nobody thought that, you know, realistically that the US was going to apply military power there. I don't think it's particularly surprising. I was working on some scenarios whereby he does follow through security crisis that is caused by all of this, and which leads to, you know, a very sharp trade war, perhaps precipitating a financial crisis, economic crisis within Europe as well. And then you could start to think about, if the chess pieces are really being shaken to this degree, what scenarios might emerge out of that? What does that mean for Europe's relationship with China, for example? Last week we saw, you know, Carney in Canada, and we saw his speech, obviously, at Davos as well. The British government has just approved China's new super embassy in the UK, which has been a very controversial subject for many years. You could start to find some evidence to suggest that there's some movement there because of the actions that we're seeing coming out of the United States under President Trump. That people are very seriously looking for that plan B. The reason I've had all this in my head, one of the Christmas reading books was Kissinger on China, and looking at that flip in those relationships in the 70s, the Nixon shot, the alignment of interest between the United States and China at that time vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. That was a paradigm shift. In this environment that we've just been talking about, why not? You know, what else is on the table? What could emerge from that?
People are looking for plan B. And I think probably my favorite moment of Davos this week was Carney's speech, which you mentioned already. It's like we finally have a grown-up in the room talking about things. And he basically declared that the U.S.-led rules-based international order is experiencing a rupture, not a transition.
Yep.
And what he's doing is urging those, he calls them the middle powers,
Yes.
so countries like Canada, maybe the smaller tier 2 type countries, to create a third path and start working together more.
Yep.
To create, right? So you're not always in a subservient relationship to the big power. Now, this sounds great on paper. Do you think this was just a great speech, or do you think this is going to start getting enacted by a lot of those middle countries?
There's potential for it. And I think we've already seen some of that emerging as well, particularly thinking about trade. EU signed the trade agreement with Mercosur, although it's now been referred to the courts. See Britain joined the CPTPP, the big trade agreement for the Trans-Pacific Agreement. And you've got other countries looking to join that as well. People like Vietnam, Thailand, Korea. You can sort of map out an arc of those middle countries who have a shared purpose and a shared interest in some kind of rules-based order, right? So Britain, Canada, the European Union, Singapore, Japan, and others. There's something there. And actually, these middle powers have the heft to be able to do it. For a few years, we've been hearing a lot more about the global south and so on. And I think people overplay that as a coordinated bloc. It's very diverse and all sorts of sort of stresses within that as well. But when you start talking about the European Union, Canada, Japan, Singapore, Australia, well, there's a lot more similarities and there's a lot more potential for them to come together and actually do something. Will that evolve? Will that act as some kind of balance or reemerge in place of the US-led so-called rules-based order? That's a long-term project. That's a generational project, I think.
I think they will have some friendly governments with this, because if you look at the way that Prime Minister Lawrence Wong from Singapore has been talking to the public in the last few months, it is, again, it's like another adult in the room. He's talking about how things are going to be difficult, but they're trying to explain rationally what is actually going on in the world. And I think it's one of the few leaders I see in the world actually taking that type of approach. So I'm kind of hopeful that Singapore would get active in this type of engagement.
Yeah, you're exactly right to highlight those speeches from PM1, one of them right at the end of the year. I think this is understood in a place like Singapore, a city-state that's open, that's dependent on trade and investment and the flow of trade and investment as well. So whether it's think tanks or policymakers, in Singapore, that's well understood. And that message of the importance of middle powers being amplified by people like Carney, that's a more positive sort of dynamic that we have in the world at the moment.
Because what they're trying to do really is get away from dealing with these bullying relationships. And we've seen now that the U.S. is willing to go to extremes when it comes to bullying. We saw what happened in Venezuela with Maduro. We saw what was going on with Greenland. There's rumors in the press that Cuba regime change might be next. How does this play out in Asia? How are they reacting to this? And what are they doing to manage the complexity of this situation?
So what you hear a lot of, particularly in Singapore, but elsewhere across Southeast Asia, is don't make us choose. We want to trade with China. It's our biggest trading partner. We want US security as a sort of moderating force in the South China Sea and the Pacific. And we want US investment and we want access to US markets. Don't make us choose. That's underpinned policy within Asia for many years. The issue is that the space which you can occupy where you don't have to choose is getting smaller. And whether it's, the technology that you're adopting or the relationships that you have, trading relationships that you have, treaties that you sign and so on, the space to be able to work with both powers has got smaller and smaller. Some countries are better at dealing with this than others. Singapore's very, very good at this. Malaysia, who was the chair of ASEAN, the ASEAN grouping last year, I think played this very well. Their economy is doing great. They're getting investment in from everybody. They signed a trade agreement with the States, although there's a controversial part in all of that China doesn't like. Within the region as a whole, which, as you know, is incredibly diverse, there are different approaches to this, and some economies and policies will hew a little bit closer this way and some the other way. If you go a bit further up to have a look at Northeast Asia, is a bit of a different story there. We, of course, had the election of Sanai Takaichi as the first female prime minister of Japan. She's just called an election, which will take place in February. And there's a sort of harder realist edge in Japan. She comes from the sort of right of the party, a nationalist hawk she's been described as. But you could also look at her policies as very sort of pragmatic and so on. So maybe I'll take a pause there, but definitely Japan, South Korea, Philippines are countries to dig into.
We're going to come back to those, but I also want to go to the elephant in the room. With the current situation, with the U.S. imposing itself on sovereign countries, what does that mean for China when it takes a look at Taiwan? Do they feel like, well, if you're doing it, why can't we?
I don't think the calculus changes much for the China-Taiwan situation. China's not about to launch any kind of decapitation action on Taiwan, although they were very publicly rehearsing for all of this, but that's all part of the theater. I don't think the calculation has changed. And by the way, the States didn't enact regime change in Venezuela. They simply kidnapped the leader. The regime is there.
I don't think they have a plan on what to do next with that one, but that's a whole separate story.
Yep.
Now, you did mention Japan's new PM, Takaichi. So she immediately comes in, and already they've had a bit of a spat going on with China now. And this has evolved because she made comments about the potential Chinese takeover of Taiwan. Now, since then, it's escalated quite a bit.
Yep.
You had the Chinese consul literally threaten to cut off her dirty neck
Yep.
on X, formerly Twitter. Chinese is banning Japanese cultural events. A bunch of concerts have been canceled. Tourists are avoiding Japan, which is said has an economic impact of about $367 million, according to Bloomberg. But the Straits Times did just report that tourist revs are still up despite all of that. What's going to happen with this? Is it going to continue to escalate this tit for tat between China and Japan, or do you think it's going to calm down?
So a few points on this. Let me sort of talk about the international relations and then a couple of points on tourism as well. I don't think this was any planned provocation of Beijing. It came out in discussions in the Diet, and she was simply reaffirming what Japan's position has been. And it's very clear if there's a security crisis with Taiwan, of course, it has implications for Japan as well. And that's been said for many years, maybe not so publicly and so clearly from a newly appointed PM. It depends where you are in the region. Definitely in Japan and elsewhere, you get the sense that China's overplayed its hand on this one. They created a bit of a storm in a teacup. Japan is used to this. I mean, go back over the last 15 years, we've had various flare-ups. South Korea was on the receiving end of this, some years back when the new missile radar system and everything like that was put in place. And they felt the weaponization of trade and tourism at that point. And in fact, Japan's been trying to reduce its exposure to all of this since 2010. So I think this will sort of die down at some point. Both sides will, with their face, be able to sort of step back from all of it. I don't see it escalating any further. On tourism, this is very interesting. So yes, the number of Chinese tourists to Japan are down. There's an article in the Nikkei suggesting that bookings by individual Chinese, mainland Chinese to Japan for the Chinese New Year period in February were up 50-something% year on year. So there's two things here. There are the big tour groups, right? And they come over on Chinese flights and they stay in Chinese-owned hotels and they go to Chinese-owned restaurants. It's called the sort of one dragon strategy. That's dried up. The individual Chinese are saying, okay, you're telling me that this is a rearming militaristic state. I'm going to go there on holiday for Chinese New Year. There's a bit of a contradiction there.
Well, I'm hoping it ends without any kind of a conflict, which I'm sure it will, because like you said, these things tend to happen quite often. You did mention there's a couple other areas within Asia you're keeping an eye on this year because of either a little bit of instability or elections. So let's look at the Philippines and Thailand on that.
Both Thailand and Japan have an election on the same day. Just to go back to Japan, Takaichi's popularity, in spite of, perhaps because of, these tensions with China, is up in the 70%. So she's very popular. Her party, the LDP, a little bit less so, down in the 40s maybe. So she's, gambling that her popularity will allow her to get a proper majority and a sort of.
Hence why you call a snap election, all out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Take advantage of it while you can, and hopefully build up your power base in the LDP.
Exactly. So I think she's probably played that right. We'll see, how the election turns out. It's always a bit of a gamble, but that should give her a clear path for her policy agenda, which actually, that's not going to turn tensions down with Beijing because there's increasing spending on defense. She's looking to upgrade the defense agency to a proper ministry, intelligence community development, and all the rest of it. Anyway, that's one election. We pretty much know what the outcome is going to be there. Go down to Thailand, on the other hand. So you've got a general election, but you've also got a referendum at the same time. And this is a referendum on constitutional change. Thailand has been beset by, political turmoil and policy stagnation for the last year or two. Growth there is very underwhelming. They've been hit hard by the trade war, trade turmoil with states. So they've got a lot of issues to deal with there. There's no suggestion at this point that we'll have a return to the type of big demonstrations that could turn a little bit ugly in Bangkok and so on. That seems to be not on the cards at the moment, which is very good. Jumping across to the Philippines, so there's no election due there for a couple of years. We had some big natural disasters there, typhoons and floods and all the rest of it, massive anger that all the money that should have gone into flood defenses has disappeared and so on. President Marcos clearly is hewed very closely to the United States. and by extension, Japan. And particularly, this has big implications for the security architecture within that part of the world. And of course, the Duterte family is waiting in the wings. If there were a political change in the Philippines, that would have big regional implications. It's not on the cards yet, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. And the Philippines chair ASEAN this year as well, and they will want to put maritime security right at the top of the agenda for ASEAN, which speaks directly to the tensions in the South China Sea and China's territorial claims there as well.
I want to close out looking at ASEAN by looking at Singapore because, as you know, I lived there for 15 years. I still track it. I still miss it. How's everything going in Singapore? It seems like PM Wong has been doing a good job keeping people informed. It looks like growth was decent, despite all the instability. What do you see on the ground right now in Singapore? How is it doing? How is it handling these crises? I know they were invited to be on the board of peace, and I think they've politely said they will evaluate it. What's your take on Singapore right now?
Go back to a little bit last year where we had the election and the People's Action Party increased their number of seats in Parliament. It's quite clear that in times of turmoil, there's a flight to sort of safety and so on. And part of the messaging from the party was, stick with us. We know what we're doing. It's a hostile environment outside and so on. And there's a lot of credibility in that as well. Singapore probably better than I do, and the quality of their policymakers and, the whole establishment around that, they're adept at this. They do engage in all of that foresight, scenario analysis. They are prepared to respond rather than simply react to what's going on in the world. So I think headline GDP growth will slow a little bit this year, but it will still be, positive. And the economic fundamentals of Singapore remain very strong. One thing that is now just over a year old is the special economic zone with Johor. This is gathering momentum. It's very successful. Johor has been attracting huge amounts of investment, particularly into data centers, and they're building out that whole ecosystem at a very rapid pace. That gives Singapore a bit of a bigger hinterland. It allows Johor, and by extension Malaysia, to tap into the regional hub that Singapore is. So that's a positive development at a sort of micro region level.
And I'm glad that they haven't gone down the Trump path and saying, I have to have Johor to be my own. I like the way that they've been working and developing that area. And you're right. I think for a lot of those things, especially data centers, because people don't want data centers in their backyard.
Yeah.
Putting that across the border over there, it builds up the environment, the tech skills in that area, and it expands the whole Singapore region a bit. Gives it more power to play.
Just a bit on that, by extension, I think Malaysia had a very good year last year. Geopolitically, neutrally positioned. The big inflows of foreign direct investment in data centers and by extension, the whole tech field, semiconductors. I spoke at a conference in Penang for that sector. Very bullish, big investment, big orders. They're very well positioned and they've been building up those ecosystems for very many years. Malaysia has played a very good game and I think they've got wind in their sails there as well. Just to jump across to Vietnam, because that's another very important country, 100 million people growing at over 6%. You don't want to ignore that. And of course, they were right at the forefront of being buffeted by, tariffs from Trump. They were one of the main beneficiaries of the China Plus One strategy and so on. And their exports to America went stratospheric. They've responded, they pivoted very quickly. So we've seen some really interesting policy developments in government, streamlining government, cutting through red tape, really focusing on making the business environment more attractive to foreign investors, focusing on new drivers of growth there as well. So, it's a very interesting set of responses around the region.
And let's not forget that about 16 to 18% of Vietnam's GDP is Samsung. If you get out to Samsung City outside of Hanoi, it is it's massive. Yeah. So it's good to see that that's still going well because I'm still quite bullish on the future of Vietnam.
Yeah, me too.
I want to come back one more. I'm going to put you on the spot on Singapore. And I want to get more of a sentiment on what people think about what's going on. So obviously the U.S. has put in a new ambassador into Singapore. And it was a bit comical before he came in because he got destroyed by the Senate confirmation hearings because he didn't really know anything about ASEAN.
Yeah, that was cringe.
One of the first things he did, I don't know if it was a letter, but it got into the press that he framed that the U.S. tariffs on Singapore was the U.S. asking for a favor from a friend who had benefited from U.S. security support over the decade. So tariffs, saying it's a favor for friends, I think that's maybe the new way we should be positioning all these things. I want more favors from more friends. That didn't really look good when it came out in the press. And the funny thing is, because Singapore press is not overtly going to be anti-American, they were polite, but they did call it out. What's the sentiment on that? How do you think the Singaporeans are thinking of the U.S. as an ally at this stage?
I think there's a lot of eye rolling. This is something that we need to manage, and we'll do that in a very sort of pragmatic, polite way, and hope that we don't come into the gun sights as other countries have done. So thank you. We've heard it. We want to work with you. We want to help and support you. Delighted to welcome your nuclear-powered aircraft carrier at Changi Naval Base. And what else can we be doing for you, and so on.
I'll be honest with you. I feel so bad for the Singapore politicians because, as you mentioned, they are highly educated. They know everything about technology to geopolitics. And now suddenly they're having to deal with this kind of crap. It's got to just be like, yeah, you're right. Eye rolling must just be the new norm.
I think so. But, it's very interesting is that Singapore's like, you don't see rowdiness in the streets. You don't see sort of mobs of drunken football supporters going through. They're not used to that type of behavior. But at the same time, as I say, they're very well positioned to respond diplomatically. Singapore always plays its diplomatic cards very, very well. It knows that it's an incredibly rich society, and it has a very important role within ASEAN, but it hides its light. And it, when somebody else makes a suggestion that they would like to put forward, well done. What an excellent thinking, even though it came from sort of Singapore, they play a very good.
Trust me, after being back now in Europe for probably almost 18 months, I miss the efficiency of how Singapore is governed. I still track it every day in my news, and I'm kind of like, God, I miss that so much. So, but let's segue away from this. We've been talking a lot more about geopolitics, but let's talk about its impact on business, because a lot of the work that you do is advising large Western MNCs. You sit in a number of different roles and boards. What is the sentiment that you're seeing now with these businesses that are trying to operate in Asia, dealing with regular chaos, tariff chaos, and everything else, supply chain chaos? What are you seeing on the ground with your clients right now?
Yeah, so maybe 2 or 3 points there. And obviously, beginning of the year, a lot of sort of wait and see, particularly when the so-called Liberation Day tariff rates were announced, and that continued through the summer. And so what do we mean by wait and see? Well, we're not going to make any big investment decisions. We're not going to do anything now that's going to come back and hit us a few months or a couple of years down the line. And when we're talking about big investments, it's a shipping line, thinking about the type of ships that they want, because trade patterns might be changing. So, well, do I need more of these ships that sell within the region, or the massive bulk carriers and container ships that go right the way across the Pacific and Atlantic and so on? These are big multi-year investments, the data centers, the infrastructure and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of sort of wait and see. That was one thing. The second thing was all the attention, particularly for American firms, and to a similar degree in Europe as well. All the attention was at home, on home markets. And so getting the type of attention, if you're a regional head of a multinational here, getting the attention that you need to be able to grow your business within this part of the world, and the understanding of the dynamics of this part of the world, I think that became challenging as well. And some of the responses from firms were, and this was a big part of my messaging, that going back to Carney, it's not a transition, it's a rupture. You really need to understand that things have changed. And that whole period of the 90s, 2000s, when you grew up, when you had junior managerial positions, when you did the MBA and all of the rest, all of those assumptions, all of the certainties of that are out the window. You're now in a new environment. You're going to have to, change. And that means fundamental change at the board level, it's strategy, your business model, and all the rest of it. Some of the, I think, more forward-thinking companies grasped that earlier than others. Companies, you mentioned, COVID earlier on and all the challenges for that. Many companies, I think, were very internal focused, driving their digital transformation and accelerating all of that, dealing with supply chain chaos and so on. And now they look up and the world has changed quite dramatically. And again, the ones that are sort of at the head of the curve, people who realize that, and they need to build that geopolitical muscle. There's a paper out just last week from IMD, BCG, and the World Economic Forum with that very subtitle, time to build your geopolitical muscle. And that's the sort of phrase that I've been using throughout the world. Understanding of the world and the dynamics and what it means for your business, your strategy, business model, and so on. I think that had atrophied, because you didn't need it. The rules-based order, free trade, liberalism, all the rest of it. So who needs to worry about geopolitics? And now that's come roaring back. Well, actually, I don't know enough about it. So the firms that have sort of got on top of that are the ones who recognize that they have gaps in their knowledge, that there are blind spots in their peripheral vision, and they're taking efforts to deal with all of that.
Well, I'm hoping that it gets a little bit more stable for them, because it'd be good to see growth get back to more normal levels. I mean, I know some countries haven't reached the levels they probably would have if there was a little bit less turmoil. What I want to go into next is some of the miscalculation risks you talked about last year that you said keep you awake at night. Not you had mentioned there's some stuff around Taiwan. You've got issues coming up with Trump's unilateral actions. Are these going to start spreading to other regions? What are you concerned about this year?
I guess going back to the conversation around, if last year was all about trade turmoil and so on, okay, sort of get that. And we know where Trump is coming from and his advisors and Lighthizer and all the rest of it. But then it did see military action in the Middle East and elsewhere as well. But okay, we've sort of seen it as limited, airstrikes and all the rest of it. The action in Venezuela, and then hot on the heels of that, all of this, nonsense around Greenland, I think that's more worrying. And this has been enunciated in that national security strategy document that came out late last year as well. That was another thing that a lot of people were waiting to see. What's going to be in that, particularly in Asia, and particularly with reference to, where is the US when it comes to its relationship with Japan, with South Korea, with Taiwan, with the Philippines in particular. So that document came out and, there's very clear focus on the Western hemisphere, and very hot on the heels of that. We've seen these actions. First of all, it's the blowing up of the alleged drug running boats, and then the decapitation action in Venezuela. And as you point out, no plan B. And so there's more of this happening, and it sort of reinforces that idea that, that Carney was saying, this is not a transition. This is a rupture. We haven't seen the states doing this in our lifetime, right? This is the so-called Don Roe mock doctrine. And I was going to say doctrine there because you could mock it, but anyway, Don Roe doctrine. He's putting military hardware behind that, military assets. That's new. This is new. That's a big worry, I think. How does that spread? What are the signals to Mr. Putin or elsewhere within the world? Yeah, that's another worry.
What's your best case scenario for 2026 for Asia? What's the best outcome? Is it to just survive the chaos?
Yes, we've had a rupture in the global order. The rules-based order is sort of gone and so on. But steady as she goes, the global economy is still sort of chugging forward. Demand takes place. People have their business plans, their strategic investments, and so on. But we're emerging into something different, a different type of globalization. I think the best sort of case scenario is steady as we go. We don't have any major blowouts. I mean, Venezuela, what's the impact on global markets? Well, immediately sort of very limited. But what are the long-term implications of all of this? What are the unknowns that stem from those type of actions? That's what I'll be more worried about. I do think we'll see more of a regional focus around economies, and whether that's the European Union externally putting up barriers to Chinese trade and investment, that's one response, or really taking a look internally at what Europe needs to do to sort of stimulate growth and all the rest of it. A lot of the discussion in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, is a need to deepen regional economic integration, but I wouldn't hold my breath for that. Neil Shearing at Capital Economics talk about the fragmented age. And I think that's a good sort of analogy for all of this. Things are fragmenting. So where do you sit? What fragments are you sort of working with within the global economy?
Now we're going to move on to, I don't know what I want to call this, maybe like the fun round. So I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions that I have in the back of my head that we don't have time to go into all of them. So just give me your quick answers on these various topics. Number one, what was your favorite moment from Davos this week?
Actually, I think Jamie Dimon getting a little bit hot under the collar with Zanny Minton Beddoes.
That sounds interesting. We talked about this one previously. My favorite one was Treasury Secretary Lutnick giving a speech at the BlackRock dinner that Larry Fink was hosting. and chaos ensued, where he was getting jeered and booed by Al Gore and some other people. ECB President Christine Lagarde got up and walked out of the event, and they actually ended the dinner before dessert because it was so chaotic. It's playground politics. And all I kept thinking is it's kind of like kids down at the beach building up a big sandcastle, working together to build it. And then some big fat bully comes in and kicks it over. He's like, I'm the boss now.
It's not very edifying, is it?
Yeah. Yeah. So next prediction, what's the next country that's going to get the Trump treatment?
Yeah, Cuba's at the front of the line there, isn't it? Venezuelan oil, which has been critical to its economy, has been or will be, cut off. Yeah, I think Cuba's not. If I was in Cuba, I'd be worried.
Now we'll go back into Asia. So with Takaichi and Xi Jinping, who blinks first in this? Is it going to be China or Japan? Or is it just going to go away and we'll forget about it?
I think it will just die down. And I think we'll have mutual sort of recognition of, okay, we went there, we're not going to go there anymore. I would hope to see that. There might be some flare-ups. And going back to the idea of miscalculations, the activity around the borders, around in the Senkaku and places like this, in Okinawa, and there's potential there for things to go wrong. Let's not forget there was a laser targeting incident just a few weeks back, which was unprecedented. So things could flare up and spiral out of control. But I think in both Beijing and Tokyo, there's no appetite for that.
That's good to know. Good. Some positive news on this one. With all this chaos that we're going to be going through for the next 12 months, because who knows what's going to happen, give me a prediction. Which country is going to fare the best, whether that's economically or politically, this year in Asia?
This year in Asia, I mean, we've already talked about Malaysia being well positioned. I think Vietnam will be doing very well as well. India, we haven't talked about India, which has been trying to sort of keep its head down underneath the parapet a little bit. Will it get a trade deal with America? It's got one with the European Union now and so on. It will be welcoming, elevated levels of foreign direct investment. The economy is growing at a decent rate. That's a quiet success story. And let's not forget, its population is bigger than China's, and it's growing faster than China. It won't be another China, but it will be a great success story. I think he's a country that's well positioned. His economy is growing, 6.5% or so. A lot of foreign direct investment going in. It's again successfully managing to work with the United States, with Europe, with Japan, even better relations now with China. And of course, even though they're committed to sort of phasing some of this out, it gets cheap oil from Russia.
Okay, next question. Which ASEAN or Asia Pacific leader do you think is playing their cards best right now with the whole turmoil of what's going on?
If we were looking at last year, I'd say Prime Minister Anwar in Malaysia. And I think it has to be PM Wong.
I would agree with you on Wong. Although I am very curious to see how this new PM in Japan is going to work out. So she's got a 70+% approval rating. That's not normal in Japan. So we'll see how long that one can last for. Next one, looking at ASEAN in particular. Do you think any country in ASEAN is going to really pivot hard towards China and ignore the U.S. relationship this year? Or do you think they'll try to still stay in between the two?
I think steady as she goes. Indonesia, we didn't really talk about, but that would be one to look at there. A few weeks ago, they announced a big purchase of military hardware from China, for example, and you've got a big Chinese presence there, particularly in resource extraction. Very early on in Prabowo's term, he was very active, flying around the world, trying to be friends with everybody as well. So that's an interesting country to look at. But I wouldn't expect any particular change in the fundamental relationships between ASEAN nations and China as a whole. Bloc, I think there's some tensions within the bloc. And I mentioned earlier on, the Philippines being the chair of ASEAN this year. They will certainly be looking to push their agenda when it comes to territorial claims in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea. So that is a source of tension that could flare up.
And the final one in this section is about risks. You look at all different types of geopolitical risks. What is something that is the most overrated risk, where you think people are worried about this, where actually it's not that big of a deal?
Good question. We spent a lot of last year talking about AI, the risks around AGI and acres of newsprint on, we're all going to be slaves to a singularity and so on. maybe that's a little bit overrated. And the application of AI seems to be taking its time.
And then the most underrated, or something that we should be looking at more seriously that we're not?
Take Trump seriously in terms of where the States is going and the actions that we're seeing. There's a lot of theater there, but then there is that iron fist that's being used. So, let's not downplay the significance of that for the world.
Now we're going to close out with a little bit on the business side. So when a Western CEO comes into you and says, should I be expanding in Asia still? What's your view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, do your homework, but fundamentally, this is where all the growth is, where the population is, where all the potential is. You've got, in many countries, very favorable demographics and so on and so on. Don't get wrapped up in too much of a risk profile. You need to be looking for where the opportunities are, and they're legion here.
It's been a little bit over a year now since you started GeoPol Asia. So what's the best part about having your own geopolitical advisory firm in a world that is complete chaos?
One of the reasons I started GeoPol Asia is because I really wanted to focus on the things that I enjoy, I'm interested in, and I found I'm good at. And this year, I've re-engaged with all of that think tank work. I've attended those seminars, I've asked those questions, I've read this, I've written that, and so on. That's been a real joy to sharpen the focus on geopolitics and of course, relating that to what that means for business. So that's been a great part of the last year or so.
And to close out, it's going to be back to the pub again. We need to figure this out. Where do you think we're going to be at the end of this year? You mentioned right now you're getting your jacket on and looking at the pub because things are a little bit crazy. What's going to happen by the end of 2026? Are you going to be going closer to the pub? Are you going to be putting your card behind the bar?
Well, what are the variables? What's going to happen to the US economy? What's going to happen at the midterms? Is there going to be any crisis that erupts? A security crisis, a financial crisis? Let's reconvene a little bit later in the year and see whether it's time to go and buy a pint or not.
I think we're going to have to do this podcast more often because with how many news and crazy updates are coming in every week, we'll need more geopolitical updates to keep everybody informed.
Indeed. Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to share your thoughts on this incredibly interesting and crazy environment that we're both living through right now. And hopefully I won't be seeing you in the pub anytime soon because the world is ending, but hopefully it's just because I'm back in Singapore and we can catch up for a drink.
That'd be great. I look forward to it. Really enjoyed the discussion as ever. We've gone over a lot of ground. There's so much going on in the world. And I think part of the challenge is keeping a steady head on all of this and to be looking beyond all the noise to the signals, what really matters within all of this. That's the important thing.
That's fine. We didn't even cover anything from the GCC. We barely covered some of the large markets like Indonesia or India. So I think we definitely have to do another podcast again relatively soon.
Absolutely. I'll look forward to it. Thanks as ever. Really enjoyed it.
Pleasure. Thanks again.
Yeah.